All right, we are back in the Fireside PM podcast channel, and I have Hardik here, who is a fellow Zoogler, but also alum of Y Combinator and now founder of his next thing. Welcome to the show, Hardik.
Thanks for having me.
Give us a little bit of a more descriptive background than I gave to you, so that people can just kind of get to know you, and then we'll dig in.
Yeah, I did YC this last summer as part of the summer 23 batch, and it was an amazing experience. Before that, I was working with some co-founders on an idea, and as we joined YC, we pivoted, and we can dig into the details there of why we pivoted. But shortly after YC, we shut down the startups. We can also dig into the details there later. But before I, entered the startup journey, I was at Google. I was part of Area 120, the internal incubator. That was a really fun experience. Unfortunately, it was cut short because they shut down the program as part of the layoffs. For me, personally, blessing in disguise. We can also double click on that later. But I was working in Google Research before. I'm just going in reverse order. Before Area 120, I was working in Google Research, and actually I translated some of the work that I was doing into Area 120. I thought there was a commercial opportunity, and I was working in like privacy preserving ML training. So not having to gather all the data into a centralized location instead of keeping it on people's devices or in companies' data silos, and then still building like a global model, but without having to move or transmit data across the network. And before research, I was actually in Google Cloud. That was my entry point into Google. Also a fun experience. I worked on Vertex AI building ML services as part of that workbench. And then I worked at Apple. Apple is what drew me to Silicon Valley, and I really popped my cherry there. I got excited by not only like building technology, because I've been building technology for a while through college, and it's part of a master's that I dropped out of. But I really caught the bug when it came to Apple, because it's not only that you get to build really cool tech with really smart people, but you get to do it and deliver it to the world and touch many people's lives. That is a drug that I've been addicted to ever since.
And what did you work on at Apple?
Recommendation systems.
Oh, cool.
Primarily the App Store. Yeah.
Love it. And then are you able to talk about what the Area 120 project was, or is that?
Yeah. So we were trying to work on a federated learning service. So the particular technique that we were working on is called federated learning. And it's exactly what it sounds like. You have this central orchestrator, and it's building up a model, but then it's grabbing bits of information from people's devices without actually exfiltrating any PII. And there are all sorts of like sophisticated techniques that go into that, but it's transmitting information back. It just doesn't contain any PII. And so as the person who's on the server side, who's trying to build out one of these models, and there are different applications. For example, like predicting what song you want to listen to next, if you're on the DJ mix in Spotify or something like that, or Google Music or YouTube Music. And so we were trying to build like a third-party version of that, so like anybody can then connect our service to their fleet of devices or their data silos, and then build their own model that way. And so we were targeting more enterprise use cases, for example, pharmaceutical companies. So outside of consumer land, where you train from people's like devices, their smartphones, pharmaceutical companies have a bunch of regional silos. And because of data sovereignty laws, they can't actually bring all that data into one place. And so they still want to build like a kick-ass model, right, on all the information that's available to them. And so they were interested in something like federated learning to do that.
Yeah. And I'm guessing that would have been interesting to cloud then as a exit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the plan.
Got it. Well, not so you've worked at Apple, Google, and then you went to YC. First of all, congrats. You have a pattern of getting those brass rings.
I know, I know. You know, I feel like I've been just like accumulating logos my entire life, but not really doing anything of real value.
You're the logo, you're like the logo hunter. I love it. I mean,
Yeah,
YC, that must have been like a completely different experience than Apple and Google. What was that like?
life altering for sure. Um, you just realized this is not particular to YC, but when you're trying to do something 0 to 1 at Apple or Google, even when you're trying to operate within like a startup oriented culture, doing
Mhm.
intrapreneurship instead of entrepreneurship, you realize that you have amazing access to distribution.
Mhm.
Google has this brand loyalty. They have so many consumers that are using their products, but also businesses, and they have those relationships. Out there in the real world, you got to build all of that stuff up yourself. And even with like the YC logo, I realized like a lot of companies that you're trying to sell to outside of tech are not really aware of Y Combinator. We'd bring up like, oh
Mhm.
yeah, we're backed by Y Combinator, and they're like, Y Combinator, is that an energy drink? Like, what is that? Right? People just don't know and they don't care. And so you realize distribution is 90% of the battle. That's one of the many lessons.
Mm. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about the process for being selected into YC. That's one of those programs where like a million people apply every cohort, and a handful get in.
Yeah. Um, I have to admit, I do think luck is involved, and to a certain extent, we won the lottery. But having got in, seeing other founders in the program, and then contrasting them with other people I know who applied but didn't get in, I've come up with this toy framework. I don't know if there's any validity to this, but the way I think about it is YC will look at an application along 3 dimensions: team, execution, and traction. And if you have a minimum of two, then there's a good chance that you'll get in. We had team, we had the pedigree, right?
Mhm.
Having chased logos all my life, I had the right branding on my resume, and so did my co-founders. We are all committed full time to doing this. That's a strong
Mhm.
signal as well.
Mhm.
Um, we had execution, and what I mean by that is like you just have to be a high velocity team. We applied actually without a product, just a vague notion of an
Mhm.
idea. And what you can do, and this is a pro tip for anybody who's looking to apply, you can send them updates before your interview. And
Mm.
so we sent them an update before we knew we got an interview, like, hey, and this was like 2 or 3 weeks after, we narrowed down the scope, we launched this product, here's what our usage graph looks like. And it was just like a spike and then a huge drop off right after.
Mm.
But we clarified that, we talked to all our users and they identified that all of these different features are missing. And so we're prioritizing all of that on our roadmap. And we're going to be working on that for the foreseeable future. And they're like, whoa, okay. So these guys can ship, but we
Mhm.
didn't have any traction. And so they felt like, okay, this is a good team. If we can orient them
Yeah.
towards like the right problem, they can probably succeed. And then other people I know, dropped out of college, so did not have the same um, resume, or had a very sparse resume, but built a company and they were pulling like, I don't know, 100K ARR. It's like, okay, these
Mhm.
guys have traction.
Mhm.
Now, I think execution and traction are quite correlated, but I think I know of like a few data points, a few people who got traction, but it just took them a really long time to get it, you
Mhm.
know? And so if it took you a really long time, and especially if you're like working part-time on your startup, then that's like a yellow flag for YC. But this is the only, that's like the framework I made up in my head. I don't know if
It
there's
makes
any
sense.
truth to it. Yeah.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. I mean, with the last scenario, traction that took too long, where the slope of the line is too flat.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're YC, you're like, well, I guess they've proven that there isn't much more here.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about the actual YC experience? Like, what was that like? What was surprising to you about it?
The surprising thing was that it was so remarkably valuable. I did like Area 120. I'm like, dude, I know this startup game. You know, YC, it's going to be totally remedial. Sure, it's a nice brand and you get 500K, but it could be like this huge distraction and waste of time. But it was the total opposite. And, you know, this is actually, I think, a common refrain from people who've gone through the program and were initially skeptical. That's
Mm,
why, like, when anybody questions YC without having been in the program or any like incubator accelerator, I would take that with like a huge grain of salt. You really have to like experience the product to be able to evaluate it. And so that was the surprising thing. Honestly, again, another framework. It gives you network, the brand halo, the funds.
mhm,
500K upfront is nice, which I didn't know actually. I thought their deal is structured such that they take 125K for 7%
mhm,
capped, and then there's 375K uncapped, and that's based when on your next round, so
mhm,
your seed round. But they give you the full 500K upfront because, and I talked to a partner about this because they found that a lot of people were just prioritizing the demo day raise because they
mm,
felt like they were going to run out of funds. So they're like, all right, just take all the money up front so you don't feel that pressure. And if you don't have something on demo day, right, that you have conviction in, you can defer and you'll be fine because you still have enough runway with the full 500K check. So network brand, the money also makes fundraising easier. So we deferred because we were stuck in like pivot hell, but other people just had an easier time raising. And I'm contrasting like people within YC and the people that I know who are trying to raise outside of YC. And it was just so much easier inside of YC. And then the last thing was, well, two more things. Coaching. I actually like the advice they give you is on a whole nother level. And that's
mm,
because they have like exclusive access to the entire startup landscape. Um, Embedded in like the YC terms are information rights. And so they know like how all teams are doing. And then they can identify like what patterns generally work, what don't. And so like they can tailor that to your startup. And there are a bunch of times where I'd walk out of office hours with partners feeling like I think I just saved like a year of my life of
mm,
learning. It's like one of the highest leverage meetings you can have. And then the last thing is the talks. I actually did not expect this, but I got a lot out of the talk. So they would have like YC alumni, famous
mhm,
YC alumni. I got to see Brian Chesky talk. I got to see Tony Shu talk of DoorDash. And because this is a closed doors talk, it's not public, they're much more
mhm.
candid about their story. And they tell you about all the mistakes they made, all the things they think they got right. And a lot of it is actually tangible, directly relevant advice you can apply.
What was one of the talks that still stands out and really made an impact about how you think about being a founder?
Oh man, every talk left an imprint. It really did. Um, I'll try to pick out a few things. Brian Chesky, when he talks about like his co-founders, like he's the face of the company.
Mhm,
A lot of people know the other founders of Airbnb, but he's like, you know, as CEO and being elected CEO, he felt like there should be just no hierarchy within the co-founder team. And when it comes to the glory, right, everybody should share in the glory. And so and I think it's changed now, but before it's like if he is going to get a cover story on TechCrunch about Airbnb, he's going to make sure that he brings Nate and I think Chris, the other co-founder, he's going to bring both of them along, right? And so always sharing the glory, making sure there's no hierarchy. I don't think there's like consensus decision making. I still think that Brian gets to make the executive call, at least in the early days, and I'm sure now as well. But that really like resonated with me. You know, you got to really function as a unit, a unified unit, and it's not like the CEO gets to bask in the glory. Everybody does. Tony Shu, he took a very like experimental approach to DoorDash. Like he would say that, yeah, you know, over the course of like a month, our team would like run 25 experiments. And one experiment would be like, you know, what I believe that Uber drivers are like people who do ride sharing, right? Who sign up for Uber or Lyft are the same people who or overlap heavily with people who deliver meals on DoorDash. And he found out like it was totally not the case because like he tried to get Uber drivers onto the platform and none of them wanted to do it. And then so the demo was completely different. You know, it was much younger and it was people on bikes and scooters who did not have a car as their mode of transportation. And so like he identified like this huge segmentation, right, within that market because he was also getting a lot of criticism about how like, you know, everybody's going to do Uber Eats or something similar because they have that relationship with the drivers. But he found this like unique insight. It's like, no, you know, the people that onboard onto our platform to deliver meals are totally different. And so like you can only get that by making contact with reality. And I'll show one more, Paul Buchheit. He was a former YC partner and famously like the inventor of Gmail at Google. And he talked about how, you know, to a certain extent, you have to see trends today that are just going to explode in the future, right? Because like you have to ride a wave if you want to become like a unicorn company. And he mentioned that like you should still see evidence 2-3 years out of that cresting of the wave. And so you should just go look for that. And that's a way that you can actually de-risk your venture-backed startup.
Yeah, that one makes a ton of sense because even if you have like 70% good execution, but you're on some freaking huge mega trend,
right?
You probably rather be that startup than the perfectly executed thing in a shrinking market.
Yeah, absolutely. Another lesson. I think Elad Gil put it succinctly, which is like a great team who meets a lousy market wins. A lousy team that meets a great market wins, and a great team that meets a great market, something special happens.
Yeah, love it. Love it. Now you talked about having a period of pivot hell. What is that and what was that like navigating?
Yeah, what triggered what was it like navigating? Torture in one word. What triggered that was our story was quasi unique. I actually found that a lot of founders in YC had a similar story. But so we were doing something in the news industry before YC, and we applied with an idea that had to relate to news. We were trying to sell to publishers, and you know, in a nutshell, we don't have to go into the product because we ultimately killed the product as soon as we joined. But we were trying to build like an ML-based intelligence platform for news organizations. So we were doing something in news, and the YC partners ultimately liked us as a team, but they thought the market was total crap. It's in structural decline. And so it's going to be really hard for us to sell into that market. And that's something we discovered in our 3 months journey pursuing this idea. So they offered us, they offered to accept us into the batch on the condition that like we just pivot out of this and do something that's more aligned with our backgrounds, which were in tech. Because like also that was the disconnect for them. It's like, okay, these guys don't really have a unique specialty or insight in news because none of them have ever worked in news. We had
Mm,
like the typical, mid-career tech engineer profile.
mm-hmm,
Two of us were technical, actually, the other one was non-technical and worked at startups, but very like conventional Silicon Valley backgrounds.
mm-hmm,
Um, and so we decided to accept. And after that, we just could not land on another opportunity. And that's not because those opportunities just don't exist. I have this abundance mindset. I think there are like an infinite number of problems out there that can turn into big companies one day. It really came down to our fundamental why for doing startups. It was my friend's idea. I teamed up with a friend. It was my friend's idea to dive into news in the first place. This has been like his calling for a very long time. I was more flexible. My goal was just to build an impactful company.
mm-hmm.
And we thought our interests aligned. And the third co-founder was like somewhere in between. I thought our interests were aligned, but the YC fork showed that that's not the case. I will tilt more pragmatic, where my co-founder will tilt more towards vision and mission. And then towards the end of YC, we just realized, he's a missionary founder, I'm a mercenary founder. And we're like two opposite ends of this spectrum. And so because of that, we just could not stick to any one thing long enough to find a fruitful opportunity. And we decided, the best thing to do is just go our separate ways because our goals, our purpose is just not aligned. And that's going to create tension, as it has, right? Through that whole experience. It's just going to create tension with every decision we make. So it was
Yeah.
fairly amicable, and we I think closed everything down gracefully.
Do you did you get any advice from the YC kind of partners around, hey, we've seen this combo missionary mercenary, like that's not a good one. You either go missionary or mercenary, but you can't have, the two concurrently, or do they want to go all missionary? Like, what was their view?
Um, I did not get any like direct advice, and honestly, this is a perspective that I've layered on after the fact, after like
Hmm.
reflecting on the whole experience. I will say, and this is not meant as a criticism on YC, but they tilt more towards the mercenary founders. And that's why like there's so much B2B SaaS, there's less
Right.
consumer, right?
Yeah.
Which is not a bad thing. Look, there's no right way to do this. I think if you match a missionary founder to the right vision or the right problem, they can succeed. And if you match a mercenary founder to the right problem, they can succeed. So there's no right or wrong here. It skews more towards like mercenary founders, and I think they maybe assumed that we were more mercenary than we were.
Mm.
Um, I've rolled this question over in my head multiple times. Can a mercenary and missionary make it work? Maybe. I think in our case, because it was just at such extremes, it didn't work. But if two founders or multiple founders were just closer to that middle area between
Hmm.
mercenary and missionary, maybe it could work. Because I do think that there are like some good counterbalances in co-founding teams. Another good counterbalance is like risk aversion versus risk aggression. Now, if you're at the dumbbell, right, at the total opposite ends,
Hmm.
then it's probably going to create a lot of friction. But if you're closer to the middle, maybe it can actually lead to good decision making.
Yeah. Yeah. That's there must be some sweet spot where you want some diversity of perspective, but you don't want them to be completely polarized.
Right.
Um, yeah, yeah. Let's talk a little bit about Pivot Hell. I
Dude, you're
I
making me relive this like traumatic experience.
it's like a therapy session.
Yeah.
So I was reflecting. lately I'm in spending like probably this year doing a bunch of product discovery kind of incubation stuff. And it's the first time that I've done this process without feeling like I'm super under the gun, like in terms
Mhm.
of investor updates or raising the next round or whatever. And the last time I had to do this was a previous startup that I co-founded that we ran out of money, and then
Mhm.
we had to find some new thing to recapitalize. And
Right.
luckily we did. And it was kind of like necessity breeds invention or something like that.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, but I actually kind of like the current flow where I'm able to kind of explore and toss out ideas, and I don't have to feel like, oh shit, I got to tell the investors that we're pivoting again, or
Right.
the thing I was so confident on, like I've now decided is no good. I'm curious what your read is like. You explored a lot of ideas at YC, and now you're kind of self-funding and incubating stuff on your own. Any differences between those two modes?
Definitely. Like the lack of pressure is nice, but I do think sometimes when you're backed into a corner, it can
Hmm.
breed stronger instincts
True.
and just make you, stick with something long enough just out of necessity to make it work. But on the other hand, even though there's like so many opportunities to commercialize out there, there are also like a lot of bad opportunities. And, it's important that you invest your time in the right opportunity. So, you know, honestly, the answer is I don't know. I'm still trying to figure it out. There's differences. I'll tell you what I learned from being under the gun going through pivot hell, which was like you do have to stick to something. Now that something doesn't have to be a product, it doesn't have to be an idea.
Hmm.
There are a multitude of those, right? But you do have to stick to a user or a market or a vision.
Hmm.
And what does pivoting mean? Pivoting means that you have one foot anchored and you're kind of pivoting your other foot around that center point. And so you got to figure out what's your anchor. Our problem was we did not have an anchor.
Right.
And so, you know, as we were like flailing and just jumping on different opportunities because of greener pasture syndrome, oh, this looks
Mm.
easy. Let's go pursue that. And then as soon as we hit an obstacle that we couldn't overcome, well, we could probably overcome it. But as soon as we encountered some difficulty, we would withdraw and then jump into another market. And when you do that, you're not really learning. And
Mhm.
that's the important thing in the early stages. You have to learn something about your user, your market, or your vision. And the hope is that even if ideas don't work when you make contact, you get negative feedback, that's okay because that's getting layered on to everything you've learned before about that same user or market or vision. And
Mhm.
now things are compounding. And so it's the important decision you have to make is what is that anchor?
Yeah. Yeah, it totally makes sense. I mean, if you are completely opportunistic, you could be talking about some idea for some customer on Tuesday, and then Thursday, someone else on the team reads this article. What about this? And it's like a completely different industry. You could be all
Yep.
over the place.
Yep.
Um, what advice do you have for founders who are trying to pick that anchor? Um, is it like, yeah, how do they decide?
Yeah, this is a failure mode for mercenary founders. It's because they're just like chasing a win. They're looking for opportunities that have line of sight to a win, but that
Hmm.
rarely exists. You're always going to encounter hidden obstacles. Um, the way I've like narrowed down my search space is I've just selected for pain points I can intuit my way around. I'm technical, I'm an engineer, and so I'm just going to focus on developer pain points. Is it a crap market? Is it hard to sell to developers? I'm sure all of that's true, but I'm prioritizing some empathy, some intuition around the
Mhm.
problem space, and so that I can learn as much as I can and iterate as fast as I can. Um, there are other ways of like picking an anchor. The important thing is like you have to stick to it for a while. And another question you can ask yourself is, hey, if I did this for 6 months to a year and I failed, would I regret that time that I invested? And if the answer is no, well, that's a sign that, okay, it's worth pursuing. It's at least interesting and curiosity driven enough that you'll stick to it for a long time so that you can get to those deep, deep insights.
Yeah, that's a great piece of advice. It reminds me I was at lunch with a classmate of mine, and we were talking about ideas that I was exploring.
Mhm,
And one of the ideas I said to him, for this idea number three, um, like I could probably be excited to work on this for the next 10 years.
mm,
And even if it were just like a moderate success, I would still be excited about it. Because obviously, if it's like a huge success, like you'll work on a lot of things for a long time. But kind of to your point, like if it's a failure in 6 months, would you still feel good? And maybe like, well,
mhm.
what if it's just like a single for the next 5 years? Are you still okay, with that?
Right.
That could be another litmus test.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Hardik, what do you do when you are exploring an idea and you're like, "Oh yeah, this could be really cool." And then you go ahead and go to your favorite web search and you're like, "Oh
Mhm.
shit, there's 3 other companies doing this." Do you immediately kind of bounce or do you say, "Screw them, like I'm gonna do it better," or what?
That's what I did in the past, and now I'm less afraid of competition. And this is like a meta point. I've just learned that you know startups are much more likely to die from suicide than homicide. Well, honestly, like it's not even startups, right? Even hyperscalers face this. Look at Google,
Mm,
right? And how it's facing off with OpenAI. There are so many unforced errors on Google's part, right? So you're much more likely to die from your own mistakes than a competitor. And
mhm,
honestly, I use the competition more as like inspiration and validation, at least at the early stages. So um, I'm not concerned that they exist and somehow my idea is no longer valid. It actually validates it to some extent because now they've kind of proven that, okay, there's a market. And
mhm.
my challenge is how can I do it better than them? And so your reflex should be in that case, oh, let me just talk to people who use those products and get their reaction. In all
Mhm.
likelihood, they'll say like, ah, yeah, this sucks. This other part kind of sucks. Sometimes they do love it, right? And maybe that's a signal that you should do something more differentiated or you should pivot out of that narrow idea space. But, it shouldn't, the mere existence shouldn't dissuade you from further exploration. If anything, it should encourage you.
Yeah, I love it. Well, how has your current exploration process been unfolding? Like, what's been kind of surprising to you so far?
Um, what's surprising to me, I've been prioritizing like the co-founder search in parallel.
Mhm.
And that was in my stank rank of priorities at the top. I've deprioritized that a little bit. What's nice about having like a co-founder is it actually does narrow down like your search space. Um, and so it actually makes it easier to just hop on to something
Mhm.
and start diving into user interviews and other exploration techniques. Now, I'm co-founderless right now, and the way I've structured things is in like 6 month cycles. Sorry, 6 week cycles. 6 months is a really long time. 6 week cycles where it's like I have to pick one thing and go deep enough to figure out if there's actually an opportunity here. And I have a bunch of ways of trying to suss out opportunities. One is just desk research, find out who your competitors are, understand the market. There are a bunch of customer testimonials out there that you can also read, and not on like competitors' web pages, but people publish blog posts and whatnot, and give their own independent, unvarnished take on some of the tools and products that they use, but then also just go talk to people. SEO is also another good thing. If you have a concrete sense of what your pain point is, you can use SEO tools to validate whether, there's actually a trend behind this observation. There are other ways too. You can post on LinkedIn, right? And see if you can get some inbound that way. You can post a landing page and see if you can get some signups. So it's like really just running all of like these mini experiments. But the key is, again, you have to stick to it for at least like a while, at least a month, so that you can breach the surface and find deeper insights, if they exist, that you can build a company around. I don't know if that helps. As you can tell, I'm still trying to figure this out.
Yeah, no, it's super cool. What's your checklist going to look like when the time comes to pick a co-founder?
Oh, the co-founder. Oh man. I think our goals, like our fundamental why, should align. And I think it basically comes down to like, is this somebody that I admire, like, and trust? And the compatibility is also part of it with like the goals and whatnot. But I found that I am like willing to go through a lot of crap, the full roller coaster of different experiences with somebody that I admire, like, and trust. Honestly, it's really a gut thing. That's what I've learned. You can come up with all sorts of different like frameworks to analyze co-founders. You could spreadsheet it out, but that's what it comes down to. It's a gut feel.
Yeah,
I know it's not a very
totally.
satisfying answer.
No, it's the reality. I mean, because I think that you're going to go through some tough times with this co-founder, and there's going to be moments where it's pretty stressful,
Yeah.
and you've got to be able to respect and trust, and there needs to be mutual respect and trust to navigate those tough times. Yeah, for sure. Hardik, it's been fantastic to talk with you. Are there any other lessons or pieces of advice you wanted to share for folks?
Yeah, I guess this is like a meta piece of advice. Well, one, I mean, I should have started with this disclaimer. Clearly, I am still trying to figure this whole game out. I'm very much an unproven founder. I am just learning on the fly and trying to pass that down to everybody. But everybody should make sure they take this with a grain of salt. The meta advice is that you should be careful about taking advice, and I understand the irony behind that. But I've just learned that there's so many situational factors that affect the distribution behind advice you get. What works for one company might not work for another company. I was working with a co-founder for a very brief time, and we were doing this trial thing. And he forwarded this podcast where this founder of a scale up was talking about how he has this Olympic culture. Everybody kind of works 12 hours a day for 6 days a week. And if you don't like that, then too bad, but that's how we do it. I'm like, yeah, for his business, that might work. But there are a ton of exceptions to that rule. GitLab. And also he was talking about how he enforces in person for his workforce. Everybody's got to be in the office the whole time. There are exceptions, 1 day a week or something. But then, GitLab, they were a fully remote company from the very beginning. And if anything, that actually augmented their business in some sense, building a company around how to do distributed software engineering. And so there are all these like different like patterns. You just gotta be careful about taking a pattern that works for somebody and then applying it to your situation or your business.
Yeah, quick follow-up. I have to believe that when you were in YC and getting advice from these superstars, that the tendency would be like, well, shoot, I mean, if Chesky says it should be done this way, like, who am I to challenge? Do you how did you navigate that kind of processing of advice, knowing that every situation is different and everybody had, even the ones that had a winning journey, like you don't know entirely why.
Right.
Could be because of their framework for how they do X or Y, but it could be other things. How did you interpret those pieces of advice from the stars?
Um, it's tough. You really just got to interrogate the principles behind the advice. So think from like first principles
Hmm.
as much as you can. Um, I'm trying to think of an example. Hmm. Oh, like, so I'm looking at problems for developers, right? And all the successful companies out there, um, when you're at scale, you're mostly like sales driven. And somebody was telling me, okay, you should start like um, building out some sales motion for your company,
Hmm.
right? For an idea that I was working on. But then as I dug into it, right, doing a little bit of like market analysis and charting out the course all these different companies took to becoming really successful players, you realize they started off purely like marketing driven. They were just trying to get as many developers to like use their tools, right? And it was free, it was open source and all of that. And it just made me realize it's like, okay, sales is going to be the primary distribution mechanism for your company, but one day, and only when you're at scale,
Hmm.
right? And so, like, the advice that person gave me wasn't wrong. It just had to be scoped properly.
Yeah. That reminds me many years ago at a previous startup, we were building this marketplace and we got advice from someone who had invested in what later became a public marketplace
Mm,
company. And he said, "Hey, I'm invested in this other marketplace and we're getting leapfrogged by a competitor who copied us and got into multiple markets sooner and kind of got
mm,
the land grab early. And so you should be really careful about that." And what we did was with seed capital, tried to go into multiple markets, like tried to accelerate our
mm, yeah,
expansion. And in hindsight, I was like, oh, he was giving me kind of like Series B advice, but
right,
I had seed capital.
right.
So, like, if you don't have the advice, probably was very sound for the
Yeah,
right situation.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which means that, like, you always have to do your own research when it comes to this stuff, and it's
Hmm.
frustrating. But what's good is like you kind of build instincts along the way of what's good and what's bad advice as you learn more and more about your customer and your business, and it becomes like intimately a part of you.
Hardik, are you going to be sharing more advice and learnings in your journey as you go? Like, how can people who are watching this, kind of stay in touch with you?
Yeah, as a result of that realization that like distribution is so hard, what I'm doing this time around, even though I haven't landed on something meaty that I have conviction in, I am front running the distribution problem as much as I can. And I'm doing that shamelessly on LinkedIn right now. I'm
Hmm.
sharing what I've learned, I'm sharing parts of my journey. So feel free to follow along. I've just started doing that and already started to build like somewhat of a following, which is surprising. But you know, follow me on LinkedIn. You might learn a thing or two. Best case, worst case, which is close to best case, is you just see a man make a fool of himself on social media.
Well, that wouldn't be the first time that happens on social media, and I don't think it would happen with you. Um, so Hardik Vala, I will put a link to your LinkedIn profile in the description after we wrap up this live stream, so people can look after you and hear about all that you're doing.
I appreciate that, Tom, and thanks for having me again. This was a blast.
You bet, dude. It's great. We'll have to get you back on. Like, I bet in a month or two, both of us will have some interesting stories to share.
I'm sure. I'm sure. Looking forward to doing this again.
All right. Take care, buddy. Bye.
Take care, man. See ya.
All right. Hardik Vala, cool conversation. Let me try and summarize 3 takeaways, and then I'll ask you guys for thoughts in the comments, and I'm sure Hardik and I can take a look at them, and I'll try and reply to as many below as I can. My 3 takeaways were: 1, I loved his framework for how to get into YC. Team, traction, and execution, I think, were the 3. I think that makes a ton of sense. The second thing was the missionary founder and the mercenary founder combo. Like, I thought that was really thought provoking. And then I think the third thing is like the art and science of being self-critical of your ideas and being willing to pivot, but also not just jumping from green pastures to green pasture and needing to anchor. So those were all terrific pieces of advice from Hardik, former Apple, Google, Y Combinator alum. And hope you all enjoyed it. And if any of you are PMs that have struggled with product reviews or want to do better at your product reviews, I am teaching a class on Maven that's starting at the end of March, so in a few weeks from this live stream. And I'm excited about it. It's going to be limited to 10 students. There'll be 4 sessions and some pre-work in between. It'll meet every Sunday morning Pacific time at 9 a.m. And it'll be very interactive and experiential. So the goal would be you'll come out of this with a much more successful product review in the next one, I guess, starting in May, because the class runs from the end of March to the end of April. And there'll be some coaching that I'll provide in between. And hopefully you'll learn a lot from the cohort as well. Since it's capped at 10 students, it'll be a small, safe space for all of us. And there's already quite a few registrants, but we do have a few more spots left. So if you want to check it out, go to maven.com/Tom L. And then if you need any one-on-one coaching, you can hit me up at tomleungcoaching.com. All right. I will see you guys later. Have a great weekend and goodbye, team.